Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your early warning briefing for Friday, the 13th of June, 2025. What a day. How well timed for Friday, the 13th, everything that's going on. This morning, we're talking Israel, Iran. We're also talking, sorry, guys, hang on. There we go. We're talking Israel, Iran. We're also talking protest and riot updates. But first, we're going to cover the sit rep. Let's go ahead and jump into the domestic sit rep. Robert, good morning. Let's start off with this House bill, and I will let you take it on from there.
Robert, you got to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. Good morning, everybody. Yesterday, the House passed this $9.4 billion rescissions bill at the request of the White House in a 214-212 vote, and this is going to make the DOGE cuts to USAID, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting permanent. President Donald Trump said yesterday that the administration is going to make policy changes to immigration enforcement, specifically targeting illegal immigrant workers at farms and hotels. And he told reporters yesterday at the White House that he's going to issue an order soon to shore up agriculture and hospitality workforces. And then yesterday, the Trump administration also reversed a memorandum from the Biden administration that included plans to breach dams on the lower Snake River in Washington and Idaho. And according to the Trump administration, it's estimated that breaching these lower Snake River dams would have eliminated 3,000 megawatts of hydroelectric power in the Pacific Northwest. And this goes back to a memorandum issued by Biden in 2023 in this area that would have potentially breached at least 4 of these dams on the lower Snake River.
All right, thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on to the global sit rep. Jared, good morning. Starting off with Taiwan.
Yes. So China issued bounties for Taiwan cybersecurity forces, and including a list of names there. And Taiwan began pseudonymizing its personnel and also monitoring its command personnel. Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense believes that the list of command personnel may actually have leaked to Beijing proper. But also they said that the Chinese media was the one that had assembled this list of cybersecurity personnel from publicly available data. Now, one official said that this list was 2/3 immaterial because they had to retire. But I think there are a couple of big takeaways. First off, China is okay with issuing bounties on these people and as a form of warfare here. And the list came from the Chinese media, not from like the Ministry of State Security, as you would expect. Moving on to the U.S. steel deal. We've been covering this for quite a while. U.S. and Japan are awaiting Trump's final approval on a deal. Now, this plan currently includes a $17 billion investment from Japan, but also requires a signed national security agreement that will give the U.S. government final authority over any kind of production cuts and the U.S. board personnel decisions. Over in Pakistan, Pakistan is responding to Israel's strike on Iran. Now, Pakistan placed all of its air force on high alert, launched fighters to protect the Pakistani borders and their nuclear facilities, and Pakistan also increased security around all U.S. embassy and consulates within the country in order to protect them from violence or protests, because obviously being a Muslim majority country, they're worried about that. Now, they claim to have no direct threat, but they are taking just precautionary measures for this. And then this has been kind of brewing in the background. Mexican President Sheinbaum clarified what she meant by mobilization from a clip that was circulating earlier this week that was actually from last month. And she said that the mobilization comment was about mobilizing politicians against the proposed remittance tax, which we even reported here that she had sent a delegation to specifically try to counter that with U.S. politicians. And Sheinbaum further claimed that her local opposition is purposely misrepresenting her statements in order to drive a wedge between her and President Trump, signifying that she wants to maintain a good working relationship with the United States on these issues, just also try to maintain Mexico's interests.
Yeah, well, she should want to maintain good relationships with the Trump administration, being that the Mexican economy is so dependent on what's coming out of the White House. Hey, Jared, quick question for you on this Taiwan bounty thing. What do you mean by bounties? Are we talking about getting personal information on Taiwanese cybersecurity troops, or are we talking about these Chinese police stations arresting Taiwanese people abroad? What exactly is bounties?
So given that they already have the information, I think it's arrest. I haven't seen it. It's all the M&D has been saying is they place bounties on our personnel. They haven't been saying what exactly they want done. But given that the information is already out on who these people are, I would assume it's take them back. And keeping in mind, China does try to enforce its laws overseas. So we consider Taiwan overseas. That's not even something that they consider. Taiwan is part of them. There was one thing I wanted to add on for Scheinbaum's clarification. If she is adamant, hey, that these riots are not us, that means that these riots are organic. It's the people in LA. Well, at least
some
not
of it, I'm sure, are people who are angry. Yeah.
And that puts the onus on them, not on the Mexican government, as a lot of people have been saying.
Yeah, I'm sure this is a case where the words coming out from Mexican government officials have helped escalate the situation. But yeah, I don't think this is directed by Mexico at all. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. Let's go ahead and move on. It's going to be a long weekend in more ways than one. We have over 2,500 protests scheduled for this weekend. I think we're somewhere around 2,000 No King's Day protests. This is something that we've been reminding everyone off and on since April. So should be no surprise. It's getting a lot of coverage. And with that, let's go ahead and jump into our SIGACs for today. Significant activities. I just want to point a couple things out. The first question, in the morning, I wake up and I read the news and I check on all the kind of hot spots around the country to see what happened overnight. And there were only 3 cities reporting unrest or reporting disturbances last night. That's down from a total of 15 over the past week. And so my first question was, is this Summer of Love 2.0 over so soon? It feels like we're just getting started. I don't think it's over, but maybe there's some good reasons why this happened last night. Let's start off with Los Angeles. LAPD arrested about a dozen activists overnight. Those were mainly for curfew violations, although DHS officers did make some unknown number of arrests after militants started throwing objects at them. Local news at the ICE detention facility, again, this is in Los Angeles, kind of the heart of this anti-ICE resistance. They reported more law enforcement officers there last night than protesters. So it does appear that state and city leaders, their words and really discouragement of rioting has had a positive effect on the situation. I think maybe there's a case to be made that an increased presence of troops and law enforcement personnel may also have a diminishing effect, maybe. I think Democrats are, though, correct in saying in general that violence against ICE does play into President Trump's narrative. And maybe that's one reason why we have seen, maybe that's one reason that explains why we have seen these riots diminish since earlier this week. Moving on to Newark, New Jersey, around 50 detainees pushed down a wall inside this Delaney Hall ICE detention facility. 4 detainees reportedly escaped. I don't have a lot of information on that, but I'm sure it'll come out later today. And then moving over to Portland, Oregon, police made 10 arrests and used some pepper spray on militants after they refused to disperse outside this ICE detention center. According to police, militants set up multiple fires in the vicinity of the detention center, and one militant was also arrested after allegedly assaulting a police officer. So just 3 cities with major disturbances last night. However, cities do remain on alert for this No King's Day of Resistance. Remember, this was a day of protest back in April, and then it was a day of action, and now it's a day of resistance. Thousands of previous indivisible and 50-51 protests. Those are the 2 primary national organizations that have been planning this No King's protest, Indivisible, and then the 50-51. Thousands of their previous protests have actually been peaceful. I mean, this has been literally largely peaceful, not figuratively largely peaceful. So I don't expect any real violence to pop off from the core of these protesters tomorrow during the day. That said, I still think the risk of political violence remains high. And maybe one reason why this rioting has died down last night is people are just kind of recharging their batteries to go out and riot tomorrow night, Saturday night. Maybe that's one case as well. Maybe that's one argument for why we did not see, I don't think, any riots last night, except for at that detention facility. Meanwhile, far left blogs and social media accounts continue publishing anti-ICE propaganda. And I mean that in the literal sense, propaganda, not in the pejorative sense. Along with these posts continuing to not just criticize, but encourage open defiance against ICE, these far left blogs and social media accounts are also publishing guides on how to form collectives and resistance groups to disrupt ICE operations. Some of this advice includes how to set up rapid response networks. We've seen those. Those have been, I mean, that stuff goes back to like 2016. But more recently, these rapid response networks, these are the kinds of things that we've seen across the country, from North Carolina to Washington State and everywhere in between, where it's kind of like the DHS, see something, say something. An activist will see an ICE vehicle and then report it up, take a picture, report it up, and then it goes out to the signal group, or it goes out to social media or whatever, and it alerts people where ICE currently is. So that is a rapid response network. And those have been pivotal in mobilizing direct action against ICE agents, because obviously when you can locate them in your area of operations, you can mobilize dozens to hundreds of protesters and activists that can go get in the way and try to impede these federal law enforcement operations. So that's the first thing, set up rapid response networks. The second thing is they're being encouraged to be combative with federal agents. And then finally, they're being encouraged to create no-go zones where ICE can't come in without large-scale support from the National Guard or from other federal law enforcement agencies to carry out immigration enforcement. And the argument that's being made is, when you do create these no-go zones and you create such problems for ICE to come in, they have to have additional security assets and resources, and that takes them from other places. So basically, this is just an effort to sap available resources, which again is a capacity issue, something we talked about yesterday. You have to reduce the capacity of the federal government to enforce these laws, and that also means tying up available resources from law enforcement. With that, we do have some some other developments here. Robert, let's bring you back on real quick, because the Washington Post just, I guess they obtained a leaked internal memo from DHS. What's the latest here? That just came out this morning.
Yeah, so according to that leaked internal memo, DHS requested the White House to federalize an additional 20,000 National Guard troops. And DHS wants these National Guard troops not just to guard facilities, but also to support ICE immigration enforcement and deportation processing operations. And then yesterday, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in California temporarily blocked a federal district court judge's order to basically ordering the Trump administration to return control of the California National Guard to Governor Gavin Newsom. And they've scheduled a new hearing for next Tuesday. So for at least for now, the Trump administration still has federal control of the California National Guard through the weekend.
Mm-hmm. And just, Robert, just briefly, so the state of California sued the Trump administration. They did successfully get an injunction from a judge. And then minutes later, the Trump administration filed the appeal. And so there's been speculation that this is going to head up to the Supreme Court. Were you able to read that first judge's order? Basically said the Trump administration is doing this illegally. I don't see how this is illegal. If you go back and you read that section of Title 10, it clearly states that a president can use National Guard or active duty troops in this matter. But what say you?
So this is Charles Breyer, who is the brother of former Supreme Court Justice Breyer. And he said that he didn't just say that this was legal, but it actually was unconstitutional and violated the 10th Amendment. I'm not, from what I've seen from some legal analysts like Jonathan Turley, the judge is wrong. That, yeah, the Trump administration, and this is the argument the DOJ made. I did read some coverage of the hearing yesterday. The DOJ explicitly said that this is in the statute, and that none of the issues brought up by the judge would negate the president's Article 2 powers to do this. So if this is headed to the Supreme Court, that's going to be the fight. And this is something the Trump administration has been doing explicitly since 20 January, is trying to reassert these presidential Article 2 powers. And now it looks like this might be one of those cases similar to these deportation cases over the last few months that is headed to the Supreme Court that could decide where that boundary is between the court's authorities and the president's authorities.
Mm-hmm. All right. So bottom line here, we will learn more during this hearing on Tuesday, the 17th. All right, let's move on to this member of the Brown Berets. Just as a background, the Brown Berets is kind of the Chicano equivalent of Black Panthers. It was started back in the 1960s, disbanded in the 70s, but I remember covering them back during the first Trump term. There have been newer chapters made, and they're trying to reestablish themselves. At any rate, this guy was arrested for distributing masks. I'm sure everyone has seen it by now, but any other details there, Robert?
Well, he was arrested. Now, apparently, according to the DOJ, he's being charged with conspiracy to commit civil disorder. And this is Alejandro Orellana, which his photo has been going around. I think he's done a couple of interviews, or did, before he was arrested. And as far as I found, he's also involved in some other pro-immigration nonprofits around California, and he has links to a bunch of these different nonprofits and NGOs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, listen, this is another reason why I've said arresting rioters. Yeah, you've got to arrest them if they are engaged in criminal activity. But that's the bottom of the chain. That's the bottom link of the chain. If you want to have an impact on the bottom of the chain, you got to target the middle and upper tiers. And that goes back to facilitators, organizers, financiers. And apparently this may actually be happening in Congress. It looks like the Republican House is actually holding some hearings. I'm sure DOJ has some open investigations. So we'll keep our fingers crossed there. And then finally, let's talk about the senator who was arrested yesterday. DHS Secretary Kristi Noem held a press conference. This senator barged in. I guess he thinks because he's a senator, he can just have carte blanche access to the DHS secretary whenever he wants. That's what it looked like to me.
Yeah, that's what the video. So when I saw the video, it did look like he basically resisted. So the federal agents that were protecting DHS Secretary Kristi Noem attempted to stop him from moving towards the podium. And then according to the video that I saw, it looked like he did effectively resist detention, and they took him out in the hallway, handcuffed him, removed him from the event. As far as I understand, he was not actually placed under arrest and charged with anything, but there has been a lot of backlash from Democrats over this. I think Bernie Sanders, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer have all put out statements basically saying that the arrest of political opponents is shameful, and I think in Bernie Sanders' statement, he actually called for effectively an uprising. He said that this is tyrannical behavior, and that the founding fathers wouldn't stand for this, and I think that was kind of a indirect call to action for some of these protests after Senator Padilla's detention.
Mm-hmm. Hey, on this topic of the senator trying to get publicity, I'm not sure if this is true. I read it on the internet, so it probably is. But apparently there's been this internal talk among Democrats encouraging members of Congress to go out and get arrested by the Trump administration for propaganda effect, basically saying, oh, the Trump administration, they're arresting all these Democrats, arresting members of the political party. They think that it's going to help them. They think that looks really bad for Trump. And so it kind of seems like with this Senator Padilla in California, I mean, it looks like that strategy may actually be true. What say you?
I would believe it. That is a well-worn strategy for political movements for at least most of the 20th century. That was a big cornerstone strategy for the civil rights movement, and a lot of these far left movements that, like we mentioned earlier, the Brown Berets and the Chicano movement, a lot of these far left groups really grew out of the 60s and 70s, and one of the major strategies they used were civil disobedience and effectively forcing an arrest so that they could use that for propaganda purposes.
Mm-hmm. Sure seems to be the case. All right, and then finally, here, the governor of Missouri activated the Missouri National Guard. He said it's preemptive. It's in anticipation, I guess, of maybe riots in St. Louis. I don't know. Where would they riot? In Kansas City side, maybe?
I didn't see where Mike Kehoe, who's the Missouri governor, specified any specific areas where he expects civil unrest. I did also check to see which other states have activated their National Guard units ahead of the weekend. And as far as I could find, the only two states that have activated their National Guards ahead of the No Kings protest tomorrow are Texas and Missouri.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have had some arrests, violence in Dallas and Austin, and lots of protests in San Antonio. San Antonio is another area where you kind of expect things to pop off. So we'll see. By the way, I do want to say the protests during the day, I'm actually not concerned about. Of course, there could be acts of violence during the day. Obviously, you have that many people there in a charged up environment. But tomorrow during the day is not my biggest concern. I think tomorrow night is probably the biggest concern at this point. So, all right, thanks for that, Robert. And let's go ahead and move on to some warning items here. All right, the NERC says data centers are now the biggest threat to grid stability. We have heard of these construction projects for data centers being delayed, sometimes up to 2 years, because there's not enough electricity. Demand is rising faster than capacity. It is cutting into reserve margins, which increases the risk of unplanned outages, especially this summer if we do have massive heat waves. Robert, what's the latest?
So this is from the NERC's latest state of reliability report they released yesterday. And they're saying that large data centers connecting to power grids are now the greatest near-term challenge to grid stability. And they say this is due to major fluctuations in power use by these data centers. And according to this report, when I read through it, they say grid stability planning has become complicated by the quick construction of these data centers. They're saying many of them are coming up faster than 2 years, making the planning process more complicated. And they also say this is complicated even further due to uncertainty over where and if these data centers are actually being built. And I did find this map from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, where you can see some of these data centers are already operating, but some of the ones that are expected to draw the largest amount of power are still in the planning phase. And I think this new report highlights a major issue for grid fragility, and that is voltage fluctuation from these data centers. Because in the report, they cited two incidents, one earlier this year and one last year, where data centers actually the power shut off, and that increased the amount of power supply on the grids. And a recent example of how this can cause a cascading outage it was the recent outage in Spain and Portugal. And the Trump administration has moved to repeal, as we covered yesterday, the Clean Power Plan 2.0. And they've been using these emergency orders to keep some retiring power plants online with the goal of making the grid more stable. However, I don't think the threat of grid fragility is entirely gone, because yesterday environmental groups filed lawsuits against the Trump administration's attempt to roll back that Clean Power Plan 2.0. And they could get a boost in their lawsuit from a Supreme Court precedent from last year that we covered that eliminated Chevron deference, which could give these lawsuits a bit more ammunition to stop the Trump administration from shoring up U.S. grids.
Yeah, listen, my brother works for a power company. I was talking to him about all this stuff yesterday, and everybody knows that this shift to solar has been bad. It does not produce enough electricity for the country. It only works when the sun's shining. And then you've got to store that electricity in a battery, which is also insanely expensive. And so at any rate, he's on the same page, kind of talking about, look, this is not good for the country, this whole Clean Power Plan 2.0 stuff, going down the wrong road, at least for the time being. So thanks for that, Robert. Now let's finally get to this Israeli strike on Iran. Jared, this is something that we've been talking about for a couple of weeks. We produce this national intelligence bulletin every Friday, and it is Israel-Iran has kind of been on the back burner. Last Friday, 1 week ago, I did move it up to imminent. I moved it up from elevated risk to imminent risk. Here, short of 1 week later, we finally have Israeli strikes on Iran. They've been threatening this for weeks. What's the latest here?
Yep. So last night, Israel, the attack that happened last night, it was targeting nuclear scientists that Israel alleged they were working on a nuclear weapon. And this was to prevent what Israel said would be an Iran-led attack coordinating Hamas and Hezbollah across all of Israel's borders. The Israeli prime minister characterized it as similar to the October 7th attack. Now, the attacks killed the chief of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and several of his underlings. I've seen numbers as high as 20. Still waiting on confirmation on an exact number, but at least several other military heads were also taken out. One of the head of their combatant command headquarters for the Iranian armed forces, and at least 2 nuclear scientists, though potentially more as well. Now, in response to this, the United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio immediately issued a statement that the U.S. is not involved in the strikes. Israel had told them ahead of time that it was going to happen. And he continued in the statement that he wanted Iran to refrain from targeting U.S. interests or personnel in the region. As of this morning, President Trump stated that he had warned Iran this was coming. Hey, you're going to face enormous issues if you don't make a deal, so make a deal. And he reiterated his call this morning saying, make a deal before it is too late. So come back to the table. Now, Iran confirmed at least 2 of its nuclear sites were targeted, with one suffering a major fire. That one you can see here on the screen. As far as why this matters, first off, Iran is not going to let this go without a response. We covered Tuesday that Iran was already threatening Israel, saying, hey, we will target your undeclared nuclear weapons if you attack our nuclear energy infrastructure, which here they have. So I think we can safely expect an Iranian response here, not the drone attack that just happened, but a proper response. They did say that they were going to use, that they had already conducted clandestine operations to get that information. And due to the U.S. presidential and secretarial statements, I still expect nuclear negotiations to go forward, because they're calling for a deal. Iran still just yesterday was saying, yes, we want to go back to the table, pending any follow-on attacks over today and tomorrow. Now, additionally, I do generally expect us to stay out of this if it actually bubbles up into a conflict, with the caveat that some defensive measures will probably be used. There were reports of Iranian proxy forces attacking American forces in Iraq last night. It may not necessarily have been directed by Iran to do so much as they just took the opportunity. But some defensive measures, and the last time that Iran struck Israel, we did see some interceptions from Navy ships over near Israel, but the U.S. did not participate offensively. Mm-hmm. Now, in the grand scheme, I do expect these strikes to actually harm the U.S.-Israeli relationship, because the peace deal that was being worked on is now thoroughly undermined. This may bring Iran to the table to actually conduct nuclear talks, but we will have to see how well we actually achieve peace between Israel and Iran here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I noticed that. I saw where some people were accusing Israel of purposely, deliberately scuttling these talks between the Trump administration and Iran. Talks maybe kind of going nowhere now. Also, on this topic of Iranian proxy groups in Iraq targeting U.S. forces in the region, Iran has extremely loose control. And I say control is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. But these groups like Kataib Hezbollah and Asaib al-Haq and the other Iranian proxy groups in Iraq, they're kind of like honey badger. Like, they kind of just do what they want. And it doesn't necessarily, just because Iran says, well, we don't want anyone to target American forces, doesn't mean American forces will not be targeted. Also here, Israel said that this is kind of the first wave of attacks, so there are going to be more attacks in the future, probably some follow-on attacks. Typically what happens, and we saw this during the Hezbollah pager attack as well. You do something extremely provocative like this, and then people start talking, and then you get that SIGINT information and you find out where other leaders are. So if this really is intended to not only be a strike against nuclear facilities, but also kind of a decapitation strike that diminishes Iran's ability to respond, then we could see obviously secondary and tertiary targets be struck over the coming days. Lastly here, Jared, I noticed we don't have a carrier strike group in the Mediterranean anymore, and that is different from the last time Israel and Iran got into it last year. Have you seen any movement, or is there any expectation that we are going to push forces into the Middle East?
If I remember right, we have an amphibious readiness group out there, which is, they're not built for providing air dominance, but they can still, for the most part, do that. The F-35C, I believe it is, the Marine Corps one, it can function well enough in that role for most cases. But I fully expect us to move a carrier over there. We need to secure the forces that we have in that region, particularly in Manama, Bahrain, a couple of major naval bases in there. Keep the Strait of Hormuz open. That's part of the U.S. interest. And then in the event that there's any, like, we need to provide support to the forces in Iraq, do so. It wouldn't shock me to find that we move a Sixth Fleet carrier over in the Med closer to Israel, not necessarily to provide support to Israel, but to any forces in like Syria, if we still have any over there.
Mm-hmm. I think it was the Truman that was in the Mediterranean. Where's the Sixth Fleet from? Where are they based out of?
Sixth Fleet is based out of Naples, Italy, and that's by
the
command ship out there is the Mount Whitney, so it's actually a floating headquarters similar to Indo-PACOM, where they have the Blue Ridge doing a floating headquarters.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then if we did, what naval forces would be required, Jared, if we were going to use air defense to defend Israel like we did last year?
Just destroyers.
Okay.
Anybody that can conduct a ballistic missile intercept.
Okay. And destroyers, they're part of the ARG package?
No, normally not.
Okay.
You can assign them just as pickets, and there's normally an independent steaming destroyer out there for that exact purpose. So the Navy doesn't say, hey, we have this ship, this one lone destroyer out here for this reason, but they always have one out there. When we went out there, our strike group was 5 deep, a carrier, a cruiser, 3 destroyers. Got out there, and that independent steamer linked up with us specifically for ballistic missile defense.
Mm-hmm.
They're just out where the ballistic missile threats actually are, and then they link up with whatever major force is actually there.
Okay. Just last question. We'll move on to audience Q&A. Last year, we saw Iran conduct these barrages of missile and drone attacks. In some cases, they did break through Golden Dome, and they did break through the U.S. air defense out there. Are we going to see something like this again? Because my understanding is that Israel struck dozens of targets yesterday, which included probably some of those launch sites and the delivery vehicles, so that if Iran were to build a nuclear weapon, they may be able to build it, but they can't get it onto a missile. But what's your expectation here?
I think so. Going back to Tuesday's reporting, saying, hey, we conducted clandestine operations to find the target information, that being able to do that inside of Israel's borders also means they can get in Israel's borders with personnel. So that may be the form it takes, is not necessarily an airstrike, but actually just using the people that are already there to conduct like sabotage operations. If I were in Iran shoes, what would I do? I would probably do both. There was a drone wave last night. I think that was probably a probing strike, not something to be intended, because like the drones are slow, ridiculously slow. They have a 14-hour lead time to Israel. So you find out where they all are and where all the air defenses are, and then take those out, move forward with a much more effective strike.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. All right, thanks for that update, Jared. And let's go ahead and move on to our Q&A. Now seems like an opportune time for China to move on Taiwan. What's your opinion on the possibility? Well, Jared, one thing we have been waiting on is for China to develop the sea lift capacity to do this. There's been some question as to whether they can or not. They've been retrofitting these commercial like the RoRos, the roll-on, roll-off ships, retrofitting them to do these shallow water deployments, or shallow, I don't know, what do you call it in the Navy? Shallow water disembarkments or whatever.
That works. Functionally, it
Amphibious
works.
assault, whatever.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So what's your take on this? Is there a window of opportunity for Taiwan here?
I think the possibility is low, very low. I don't think that the Chinese are ready, and part of that is the carrier ops that we were just covering earlier this week. If they're still practicing that, they're not ready to run a block. Sorry, not run. They're not ready to set up a blockade because they don't have the defenses.
Mhm.
That said, seems like an opportune time. Yeah, absolutely. I've been saying that since January. If the readiness levels are now in reverse of what they have been for the last 10 years. The US and its allies are getting more ready than China has been. China is trying to meet a certain goal. That does not work well for China because China's still technically behind everybody else. They have to be able to do they have to get ahead of the region. If they're going, like, I think the most effective time for China to move was 2022, barring that, right now. But it doesn't look like they're ready. So I don't think the possibility is high.
Mm-hmm. All right. Next question. Any possibility of sleeper cells among these protesters to come? I mean, is there any possibility? Sure. We've heard of Hezbollah, obviously, is in the United States. That's an Iranian group. I mean, really, the Iranian military is not built for force projection. They don't have a strong conventional military. And, instead they just give millions of dollars, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to these proxy groups, and they're able to operate all around the world. So we know they're in the United States. Is it possible? Yeah, sure, of course. And then there's the Sarah Adams talk about 1,000 or whatever she says, 1,000 Al-Qaeda and Islamic State agents or various Islamist terrorist agents in the United States waiting to conduct this 9/11 2.0 attack. I mentioned earlier in the week, I texted Sean Ryan a couple weeks ago, and I said, hey, this June 14th, and I texted him because Sarah Adams is on his podcast regularly. And I pointed out, just said, hey, look, we're probably going to see 3 to 5 million Americans mobilized for this No King's Day. We know 99% of them will not be armed. And so it's probably a very soft target environment. And if Sarah Adams is right that these groups are planning or want to conduct some Mumbai style swarm attack where you have these groups of armed assailants, and if they want to kill 50 or 60,000 Americans, which is what Sarah Adams says, well, you've got 3 million out in the open this weekend. So, probably pretty low possibility. I can't say it's zero. Frankly, that's probably like my biggest concern in terms of large scale risk, catastrophic risk. But, it's not impossible, but I think it's pretty low. But then again, I don't track these groups for a living, so I can't give you a better answer than that. But yeah, obviously it's a concern that I have just looking at the risk picture overall. So Caleb, good to see you in the chat. Next question. Do we see the Rising Lion operation leading to regional war, considering Trump's latest remarks? Well, I don't know, Jared. I mean, Trump did say that the strikes were excellent, I believe, and he seemed somewhat supportive of them this morning. I haven't been paying attention to this. I don't even know what Rising Lion is. I guess this is the Israeli operation.
Yeah, that's the name of the operation.
Yeah. Okay.
I saw Trump's remarks. He used hedging words. I don't remember if it was potential or possible, but hedging words to say that a regional war is on the table. And yes, a regional war is technically on the table.
Oh, sure.
I do want to throw out that, we saw Israel and Iran trade strikes back in October of last year, and it did not lead to a regional war. So that is still a possibility that they trade strikes, nothing happens, just so they can save face internally.
Mm-hmm. Iran has just been suffering from hemorrhaging. I mean, just catastrophic bleeding from the war in Syria. I mean, Hezbollah got wrecked in Syria, and then a lot of the support's been going to Yemen. The support's been going to Palestinians, I think, to some level. So it seems to me like Iran's capabilities have just been bled dry. And again, I don't sit at the Iranian desk, but it seems to me like IRGC, between losing high-level leaders going back to Qasem Soleimani and And it just seems like every new IRGC commander or Quds Force commander just gets killed every few months. It just seems like they're probably not in the best position to go fight a war with Israel here.
Yeah. There are also major external pressures to not have this escalate. Like the Strait of Hormuz, we put out warnings here. Hey, you're going to see rising gas prices, but that also matters for all the great powers like Russia, China, and the United States. They all need to refill their strategic petroleum reserves before the 2027 deadline. Like, it's in all of their interest to press on whatever levers they've got to make sure this does not escalate. So it's not in Iran's interest. It's not in the greater powers' interest. It's not in the region's interest. It may generally not be in Israel's interest. Like, there's a lot of pressure to keep this at a very low level and not let this rise to a regional war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would also note the Saudis. I think Mohammed bin Salman came out and explicitly said, if Iran gets a nuke, we're going to get a nuke. So it seems like a lot of these Gulf countries really do not want to see Iran. They don't want to see Israel and Iran get into a war. They also don't want to see Iran get a nuke. So, all right, thanks for that, Jared. Let's move on to the next question. Is anyone keeping track of the politicians that are inciting dissent and or those who have been arrested? Yeah, I would say roughly. I mean, Robert, we pick up on a lot of that stuff. We reported on it. We included in the report. We don't have a master list here, but it's also been relatively not that many.
Yeah, it's mostly, from what I've seen, Chuck Schumer, Bernie Sanders in the Senate, in this case, Alex Padilla, who was arrested or was detained, and then mostly local politicians in Los Angeles and California, like Karen Bass, who's the LA mayor, and I think one of the LA City Council members. Other than that, it's not been very many high-profile incidents of, especially arrests.
Mm-hmm. Well, there has been, I would say, incitement, not necessarily incitement to violence, but I think probably not explicitly. The best you could say is maybe it's been implied. But we have seen a lot of very senior Democrat politicians. Chris Murphy, Democrat from Connecticut, is one of them, a senator. And he was saying back in March, eventually we're going to have to get hundreds of thousands of people out into the streets. And he said the left is going to have to take up, quote unquote, exceptional tactics against the Trump administration. Kind of this go along to get along. We're just going to politically oppose Trump kind of stuff is not going to work. We're going to have to get out and do things like direct action and civil disobedience, and we're going to have to directly intervene. By the way, when I say direct action, Robert, I know you know this. I'll just say this for the general audience. There's protesting, and protests are pretty toothless. They have been sustained, but Trump does not care about protests. Democrats care about protests. I think maybe some Republicans care about protests, but protest is not going to stop ICE. And this is what some Democrats have been saying for a while, is that you have to get out and not just protest and express your displeasure. You have to get out and directly intervene. And that's direct action. That's getting in front of an illegal alien and ICE and not allowing ICE to arrest the illegals. So, I think that's why we've seen a lot more civil disobedience. And we're on the front edge of this. I don't think Trump came out yesterday and said, well, we're going to look at the farm workers and maybe we're not going to go onto these farms and arrest all these illegal aliens picking our broccoli and lettuce or whatever. But I still expect them to go into these cities and remove illegals. So Robert, I'll give you the last word here and we'll move on.
So the protest thing, usually the idea behind a protest is showing that you have a crowd, the concept of crowds, but it isn't effective, I think, in this situation where it's an 80-20 issue, where Trump does have, according to polling, both before and after the election, support for deportations. And that's why I think even these, like Chris Murphy and some of these other Democrats, see them as being ineffective, is because it's only really effective to a tailored audience. And in this case, they're doing these protests in cities where the local government probably already agrees with them. And like you said, Trump doesn't care because Trump is not the mayor of Los Angeles or Seattle. And that's one of the reasons, I think, also why you saw the same thing with the pro-Palestine protests last year that kind of fizzled out, is because it was an 80-20 issue. 80% of people don't want to have their flights delayed because of a highway blockade. And they started looking at more of these direct actions, and I think part of the issue going forward with the people who are trying to do these protests rather than go to a direct action model is that protests in places like here in Florida are not going to be popular. And I think yesterday there was even a press conference hearing that included the sheriff where I'm at in Brevard County, where they highlighted that Florida has been passing laws, anti-protest laws effectively. They're not outlawing protests, but they are making it effectively a crime to engage in some of these more disruptive tactics like the highway blockades and things like that. So I think is the protest effectiveness is diminished by the regionality of it. I think like in some places the local government doesn't care, so the protest isn't really going to have an effect. In some places the tactics they've used have become explicitly potentially illegal for these protesters, and I think that's also going to hit the effectiveness of these protests as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Americans do not like violent social movements. Sometimes it takes them a while to come around, but Americans do not like seeing violence on the street. I was reading this morning also, I think it was over at CNN, they interviewed a bunch of business owners in downtown LA, and these people outside Dodger Stadium said, "Oh yeah, we sell a bunch of stuff to tourists, and we sell." He said, "I haven't made any money for days." So I do think this is pretty unpopular with business owners. They don't want to board up their windows. They don't want to close down their shops. They don't want their employees to be accosted. So, I think that's probably one reason why we've seen Karen Bass and Gavin Newsom really come out and say, this has to be peaceful. This cannot continue to be violent. So, all right. Thanks for that, Robert. And I'm going to breeze through the rest of these questions here. Do we have an idea of the number or percent of our population that's actually involved in the civil disobedience arena? I mean, anytime you're dealing with low intensity conflict, you're almost always dealing with a fraction of less than 1%. So I couldn't tell you the percentage, but these protests and even the riots, they do not hold a candle to 2020. They do not have the scale or the intensity of what we saw in 2020. I could be wrong. I don't think I'm wrong. My brother-in-law says the only time I'm wrong is when I think I'm wrong. But I've been telling people since last year, we're not going to have a Summer of Love 2.0. It will not have the same scale and intensity that we saw in 2020. And even though there's been people have made a lot of hay about these riots, which fair enough. Yeah, sure. I mean, there have been riots. They have not been as large as 2020. Last night, we basically saw zero riots. We did see some disturbances and we saw some arrests, but they happened in 3 cities, which is down from 15 overall in the past week. So obviously hold your breaths and let's see what happens tomorrow night. But this is not a 2020 2.0. It's nowhere close. And it will probably not be anywhere close. Now, next summer or by 2028, I can't say anything's 100%. But if I had to push all my chips on into a single year of when we were going to have a Summer of Love 2.0, a real 2.0, it's got to be 2028 at this point. All right, Zachary, thank you for being here. Thanks for watching. By the way, we do have some new viewers today. We do this every morning, starting at 8 a.m. Central Time, a daily intelligence briefing. So we talk about what's going on geopolitically, just the big stuff, the stuff you need to know about. And one thing that we try to do every morning is reduce uncertainty about the future and talk about things that, I think this is more likely to happen. I think this thing is less likely to happen, so that we can have accurate expectations of the future. And once we have accurate expectations of the future, then we know what to plan for, and we know we can start thinking about how to mitigate these risks. And that's what early warning is all about. Carl asks, do you see China using this to execute some cyber attacks on the U.S. using Iranian's footprint? Jared, we have seen this, lots of state-backed cyber actors using the TTPs of a foreign country for some plausible deniability. My gut, my 96 Bravo intuition says this is probably not a big concern right now, but what say you?
I don't think so either, for the same reason that I think it won't go to a regional war. It's not in China's interest to cause a spike in oil price right now. They need to fill their SPR.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Do we see any other countries or groups claiming to aid or support Iran?
Nope.
What would a two-front war be possible for Israel to win given their ongoing war in Gaza?
I don't have an answer for that one.
Well, it
probably depends on
it
which
probably
fronts.
depends on what two-front we're talking about. If this is trading missiles and drones back and forth with Iran, yeah, sure. I mean, I think Israel could probably do that. No one's talking about an invasion here, so it's probably hopefully limited exchange. Skydog, good to see you around. Thanks for being here. Any intel, Jared, around UK, France, US, Jordanian aircraft intercepting drones over Jordanian airspace? We did that last time, by the way.
Yeah, I haven't seen that, but I would expect it.
Mm-hmm. Do we need foreign oil? You know what we need more than foreign oil is the U.S. problem is not a problem of getting oil out of the ground. It is a problem of getting oil through refineries to refine petroleum products like gasoline and diesel. A lot of that refining happens overseas, believe it or not. We ship crude oil overseas for refining, and then we import that back into the United States. We have not built a refinery since the 70s or something like that. So we are much more dependent on refining than we are on oil. But yeah, it's obviously a concern. If the worst case scenario, I don't think this will happen, but the worst case scenario is that Iran tries to cripple Iran and attacks oil infrastructure. That would be probably one of the worst case scenarios, because that would throw entire oil, the global oil market, into disarray. And I would also remind you, I don't think a recession is imminent in this country, but a lot of people have talked about it. I think it's every recession that we have had, or almost every recession that we've had since 1960, we've had some spike in oil prices. Historically, that alone can cause a recession in this country. I think it's like anytime oil prices double over a short period of time, it leads to a recession. So this is something that Trump does not want. They're trying to keep getting inflation down. A big part of that is getting oil prices and gas prices down. This would be bad for the United States in more ways than one, especially economically. If we're paying a lot more for gas, because then all prices go up. What are the odds that Israel's strike on Iran paves the way for a popular revolution in Iran? I would say it's not impossible. There's been talk about Israel killing senior leadership in Iran, not just military leadership, but the spiritual, religious leadership. I probably wouldn't want to do that unless you're ready to fight a large-scale conflict. I don't know, Jared, what say you? Listen, there is a revolutionary movement inside Iran. There is a resistance or oppositional movement. In what was it, 2009, the Green Revolution? There was an attempted revolution in Iran, a counter-Islamic revolution by more moderate elements. I don't pay attention to them. It's just not my part of the world anymore. But Jared, it doesn't seem like Iran is on its way towards a revolution. I could be wrong.
Yeah, I don't think so. And again, we're talking about, the great power. Iran's a lesser power. Is that in Russia and China's interest to even let that happen? The moment that starts, thinking back to 2022 in January, Russia had something similar happen on its border, and it immediately stepped in and shut that down. Iran's not part of the CSTO to justify that, but both China and Russia have an interest in maintaining some semblance of stability in Iran.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, certainly. Yeah, if you're Russia, you definitely, or China, you do not want to lose Iran as a regional actor. All right. Yeah, Ben says latest U.S. refineries built in 1976. Yeah, we don't have a crude oil problem. We've got a refining problem. To the point where, even California, they were closing down that refinery. Hey, Robert, remind us, California did or was going to close down one of its last refineries?
I think they're planning to close down two of them. It would actually, what's happening is these companies, I think Phillips 66 is the biggest one, and they have their refinery in LA. They're planning to close because of a state level law that was going to impose like fines on them and allow basically the state to fine them for pollution for that climate change general fund thing that's been happening in some of these states. I don't think that the plant closure, the refinery closures are supposed to take effect until later this year. And I think the second one is early next year.
Mm-hmm. Can we not see I know the Energy Department has some Energy Powers Act or whatever it's called. What is that thing, Robert?
The emergency, the Federal Power Act, Federal Power Act.
So we have seen the DOE come out and tell certain plants you cannot close down. Power plants you can't close down. Do we expect them to tell this to California on these refineries?
I don't think they have the power to do that because the state isn't forcing the state is indirectly forcing them to close it. Gavin Newsom is not telling them to close down. Mm-hmm. This is just the effect of that climate change general fund policy and some other emission stuff. I think the Trump. I think I've seen the Trump administration mention this a couple of times over the last 6 months. I'm not sure what actions they could actually take to do this other than sue the state for its impact on like interstate commerce. But I haven't seen a lawsuit yet.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, it's bad news if you're on the West Coast pad, dependent on those refineries for your fuel. All right. Well, thanks for that, Robert. We're just about at an hour, so everyone, that's going to do it for today's morning briefing. Just as a reminder, we do this Monday through Friday, starting at 08 Central Time. We talk about the things that matter, talk about global risk and domestic risk as well. It is what we do here. And thank you for watching. By the way, we almost have this new open source intelligence platform built out. We're working on some of the automated tools on there. We are going to get that launched either over the weekend or on Monday. So starting next week, we'll take all of our current early warning members. You'll be moved over to the new website. You'll have access to the watch floor and everything that's over there. And then we'll start taking new signups as well. So if you want to see what happens over on the high side, peek behind the curtain on our domestic and global intelligence, you can do that starting next week. We'll have a lot more details then. So everyone, thanks so much for watching. That's going to do it for today and also for this week. Have a great weekend. If you are going to go out to monitor the protests, just be safe. Keep your head on a swivel, as they say. I would say in general, avoid the protests, avoid being in big cities. That's my biased opinion. However, some people are going to be out there for S's and G's. So we wish you the best of luck. By the way, someone messaged me and they said, Mike, I'm going out to this protest just to observe. What's your general advice? Document anything suspicious. If something feels off, take a picture, get a video, whatever. Don't allow it to impede on your situational awareness. But I'd say more evidence is in this case, more evidence is better than less. And also, if you see any like communist insignia, if you see any of the far left political parties, any black bloc demonstrations, obviously do document that and let us know. Because one of the things I'm trying to do is, I'm looking at these LA riots and I say, is this a traditional Antifa black bloc style riot? Or is this like a Mexican nationalist or some other not exactly far left, not exactly socialist or communist demonstration or movement? And I'm not sure. I know Antifa is extremely opportunistic. They glommed on to the BLM riots, and protests. And let me just say this. I'm not going to call anyone out specifically, but there's a lot of people talking about, this is the far left armed revolution. It's going to happen. There's going to be paramilitary action. And they have this little, there's this pretty famous pyramid that was starting to be published back in the 1960s by the Special Operations Research Organization. And they used it to track Maoist revolutions. And it's just a pyramid, and it has different levels, and it moves from clandestine or from covert things that are difficult to observe, like organizing and recruiting. That's not instantly easily observable. And it moves up to overt action, which is going to be like your military and paramilitary action. And there are people that say, we're right on the cusp. We're about to start having paramilitary action. And then they point to these riots. Look, this is paramilitary action. Guys, that's not paramilitary action. That's like sabotage and rioting and general unrest. Paramilitary action is armed, organized political violence. This is a group of dudes, primarily going to be dudes, a group of armed dudes going out and conducting raids and ambushes. And I'm not trying to be extreme here, but I'm just saying a lot of people share this pyramid, which is very interesting. And we can use it as a gauge to determine where we are in this type of low intensity conflict. But paramilitary action is combat, raids and ambushes. We are not close to that. We are well below that line. You know what? I'll have this on Monday. We're going to talk. I'm going to bring this up. We'll talk about it on Monday. I'll step you through it. We're nowhere close to paramilitary action. And unfortunately, the people sharing that, maybe they think they understand it, but there's a fundamental misunderstanding there of what that pyramid actually is. And this is what happens. This is like Dunning-Kruger. When you look at it and you say, oh yeah, that makes sense. We're close to paramilitary action. We're not close. We are nowhere near close. And so with that, it's going to do it for this week. Everyone have a great rest of your weekend. Be safe out there if you do. And we'll be back in your inbox on Monday morning, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.